My daughter, Marlo, showed up on our porch with two small backpacks and the kind of smile that feels practiced. She said it was only for 2 hours because she and her husband, Hayes, had urgent things to handle, and she placed my grandkids, Tessa and Nolan, right into our living room like she was dropping off dry cleaning. I watched their eyes scan our house the way kids do when they're trying to figure out if this is fun or trouble, and my stomach tightened before I could even say hello properly. Hayes didn't step inside. He hovered by the car, tapping his phone, already halfway gone. Marlo kissed the air near my wife's cheek, not her cheek, and said, "Dad, please, don't make this a thing." I wanted to tell her that a thing is exactly what it becomes when you don't look your parents in the eye, but I swallowed it because I've been swallowing things for 60 years. My wife straightened the throw blanket on the couch like the fabric could keep the moment from unraveling, and I forced my voice to stay calm as I asked, "What kind of urgent?" Marlo's answer was too quick. "Paperwork, appointments, you know," and she looked past me into the house like she was checking what else she could leave behind. Nolan tugged my sleeve and whispered that he was hungry, and that small whisper hit me harder than any argument ever could. I said, "We'll do grilled cheese," and I tried to make it sound like a normal afternoon, even though my hands already felt clumsy, like my fingers knew trouble was coming and wanted no part of it. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Tessa asked if they were sleeping over, and Marlo laughed, one sharp little laugh, then said, "No, sweetheart, we'll be right back," without actually answering her. Hayes called from the driveway, "Marlo, now," like he was summoning a dog, and I saw my daughter flinch before she covered it with another smile. She promised again, 2 hours, then she was gone, and the car backed out so fast the tires crunched the gravel like an insult. I stood there holding Nolan's backpack, staring at the empty road, and I realized I couldn't even remember the last time my own daughter hugged me like she meant it. When 2 hours passed, and my phone stayed silent, my chest filled with a slow, cold dread that made every tick of the clock sound louder than it should. By the time midnight arrived, there were no calls, no texts, only a single message from Hayes that didn't ask how the kids were, only where the kids' documents were kept. And that's when I understood they hadn't left them with us for 2 hours. They'd left them with us to disappear. The first night felt like a mistake that kept breathing, because every sound in the house suddenly mattered more than it should have. Nolan couldn't sleep and asked if his parents were stuck in traffic, and I lied so poorly that even the dog looked at me like I was incompetent. I burned the first batch of grilled cheese because I forgot to lower the heat, then joked that this is what gourmet looks like after 60, but my hands were shaking too much for the humor to fully land. My wife tried to organize bedtime like it was planned, laying out pajamas that didn't fit quite right and brushing Tessa's hair with the same care she used years ago, except slower, like time itself had stiffened her wrists. I checked my phone every 10 minutes, then every 5, then stopped pretending I had a system and just stared at it like it owed me money. At 2 a.m., I called Marlo, and it rang until the line went dead, not voicemail. Dead, like someone had shut a door on purpose. That's when the worry turned sharp, because accidents don't mute phones, but people do. I told myself not to panic, the way older men do, as if panic is something you can politely decline like dessert. In the bathroom mirror, I saw a version of myself I didn't recognize, same face, but heavier eyes, like I'd aged 5 years between dinner and midnight. Tessa woke up crying because she'd had a dream that we moved without her parents, and I sat on the edge of her bed, nodding like I understood childhood logic even though it was tearing me apart. I joked that if we ever moved, it would be somewhere warm with bad plumbing and cheap coffee, and she laughed through her tears, which felt like winning a tiny, unfair victory. By morning, there were still no messages, but Hayes sent another text asking if we had any legal paperwork for the kids, as if he were checking inventory. That word, legal, settled in my chest and didn't move, because people don't talk like that unless they're planning something ugly. I made pancakes shaped like misshapen states, blamed arthritis for the geography, and smiled while inside my thoughts raced in circles I couldn't slow down. By noon, I wasn't just worried anymore. I was beginning to understand that we weren't babysitting, we were being positioned. And when my wife quietly asked, "Do you think they're coming back?" I didn't answer, because the truth had already started forming, and it scared me too much to say out loud. By the third day, the house had shifted its weight, like it knew it was carrying more than it was designed for. I found myself making school lunches with the seriousness of a man defusing a bomb, reading labels twice because Nolan is sensitive to red dye, something no one bothered to mention during the 2 hours speech. When I called Marlo again, the call went straight to voicemail, and her greeting sounded cheerful enough to make my teeth ache. I left a message I didn't recognize as my own voice, too polite, too calm, like I was asking about a delayed package instead of my grandchildren's parents. The school office asked why the kids weren't picked up on schedule, and I joked that retirement apparently came with surprise parenting duties, but the laugh caught halfway out. I realized we didn't have medical cards, emergency contacts, or even the name of Nolan's dentist, and that ignorance felt like a quiet accusation. At the pharmacy, I stood squinting at a prescription bottle that wasn't theirs, wondering how many grandparents had made this same confused face before me. I told the clerk my eyesight was vintage, and she smiled kindly, which somehow made everything worse. That afternoon, Hayes finally answered a text, not with reassurance, but with a warning that we should not confuse temporary help with entitlement. I read it twice, then a third time slower, like maybe the words would soften if I treated them gently. Instead, something inside me hardened, because entitlement is what you accuse people of when you want to rewrite history. I thought about the years my wife and I skipped vacations, about the money we quietly spent, about the nights we held fevers and fears that weren't technically our responsibility. I dropped the plate while thinking about it, watched it shatter, and muttered that at least something around here was honest about breaking. When my wife swept it up, she said nothing, but her silence pressed heavier than any argument we'd ever had. That evening, a certified letter arrived addressed to us, thick and official, sitting on the table like it knew it had power. I didn't open it right away, because some instincts come with age, and one of them is knowing when a piece of paper is about to change your life. I opened the certified letter with the same care I use for old jars, slow and suspicious, because nothing good ever comes sealed that tight. Inside was a notice written in clean, confident language, explaining that Marlo and Hayes were temporarily transferring responsibility, and that we were expected to comply, without interference. The word temporary sat there like a joke told by someone who doesn't understand humor. I read it out loud, then read it again slower, because sometimes clarity comes only after repetition, and sometimes it just hurts twice. My wife asked what it meant, and I tried to explain it gently, like translating a foreign language I never wanted to learn. I cracked a joke about how I'd apparently missed the class where parenting turns into a legal subscription service, but my voice sounded thin even to me. When the kids came home from school, Nolan proudly announced he'd volunteered me for Grandparents' Day, and I nodded like this was all perfectly scheduled. I stood in the kitchen later staring at the fridge, forgetting why I'd opened it, which is either stress or age, or both teaming up against me. I called a family lawyer I barely remembered, a man named Corbin Shaw, and he listened longer than most people do these days. He didn't interrupt, didn't reassure, just asked quiet questions that felt heavier than advice. When he finally said, "This isn't normal," I felt an odd relief, because fear is easier to manage when someone names it. That night, Hayes sent a message saying we should keep things calm and not involve outsiders, which sounded less like concern and more like instructions. I laughed at that, an actual laugh, because the idea that this was calm would be funny if it weren't so insulting. I tucked the kids into bed and realized I was memorizing their breathing patterns like a man preparing for a storm. As I turned off the lights, a thought settled in me with quiet certainty. This wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about control. And once I understood that, something in me stopped bending and started bracing for impact. The humiliation didn't arrive loudly. It came dressed as concern, which somehow felt worse. A woman from Child Services showed up mid-morning with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her eyes, saying she was just following up on a report. I offered her coffee and immediately spilled half of it on the counter, then joked that my hands shake when authority enters the room, which earned a polite nod and nothing more. She asked why we didn't have written permission, and I explained the 2 hours story like a fool repeating a bad excuse he didn't invent. My house suddenly felt too small, like the walls were leaning in to listen. She glanced at the kids' backpacks, asked about school arrangements, medical consent, bedtime routines, and every question landed like a reminder of how unprepared we'd been made on purpose. I cracked another joke about learning modern parenting on the job at a senior discount. But even I could hear how desperate it sounded. When she asked whether the children had been taken without consent, my ears rang, because that's how quickly love can be rebranded as something criminal. I wanted to shout that these kids knew where the cereal bowls were, that they fell asleep to the sound of our old floorboards, that they called this place home without thinking. Instead, I nodded, because older men learn early which battles cost too much breath. After she left, I sat down too hard on the couch and realized my knees hurt in a way that felt permanent. No one asked if we were in trouble, and I told him no, then immediately hated myself for lying so easily. That afternoon, Hayes sent a message saying we were overstepping, and that this was exactly why things needed legal boundaries. I read it while standing in the laundry room, holding a sock that didn't belong to anyone in the house anymore. Something in me snapped, not loudly, not visibly, but cleanly, like a rope cut on purpose. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of what they were doing next. I was afraid of how far they were willing to go. By the end of that week, exhaustion settled into my bones the way cold does, quietly, then all at once. I forgot where I parked the car outside the school and spent 5 full minutes pressing the alarm button like it might confess on its own, until a teacher gently pointed 20 feet to my left. I laughed it off, said retirement had turned my memory into abstract art, but inside I felt the sting of being watched and measured. The lawyer, Corbin, called and asked if we'd be willing to document everything, and I said yes before my pride could interfere. I started writing dates and times on yellow notepads, my handwriting drifting like it was tired too. Every line a small act of defiance. At dinner, Nolan asked why his dad didn't answer the phone anymore, and I focused very hard on cutting chicken into pieces that were too small to argue with. I told him adults sometimes make bad choices when they're scared, and he nodded like that made sense, which nearly broke me. My wife burned the toast and apologized 3 times, and I told her it tasted nostalgic, like the 70s, which earned a weak smile. That night, I lay awake listening to the house creak, counting sounds the way you count sheep when sleep refuses to cooperate. I thought about my age, about how easily people assume time has already taken everything important from you. Hayes sent another message saying court involvement would damage the children emotionally, and I wondered how someone learns to type without feeling. I stared at that message until the words blurred, then deleted nothing, because evidence is a strange kind of hope. In the mirror, I practiced a calm face, one that didn't look like it could crack under pressure, even though my jaw ached from holding it. I realized then that this wasn't just about keeping the kids, it was about proving we weren't disposable. When I finally slept, it wasn't rest, it was a pause, the kind you take right before bracing yourself. Because deep down, I knew the next step wouldn't come quietly, it would come dressed as authority, asking us to step aside. The court notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between grocery flyers like it was trying not to be noticed, which somehow made it feel crueler. I read the word hearing 3 times before it registered, my brain moving slower than the situation demanded. They weren't asking anymore. They were accusing, using words like unlawful retention and failure to cooperate, as if love had a return policy we'd ignored. I laughed once, out loud, because if someone had told me 10 years ago I'd be preparing to defend myself against my own daughter, I would have checked their medication. I tried printing the notice and ran out of ink halfway through, leaving the page looking like it had been censored by fate, which felt appropriate. Corbin said this was the moment where silence stops being dignity and starts being surrender. That sentence stuck with me longer than any legal explanation. When I told the kids we had to visit a big building with serious faces, no one asked if he needed to dress nice, and I said yes, because sometimes pretending things are normal is the only mercy you have left. My wife ironed a shirt that hadn't been worn since a funeral, and neither of us commented on the coincidence. I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tie, realizing my hands weren't steady enough to make it look neat, so I told myself crooked was honest. Hayes sent one final message saying we should do the right thing and avoid embarrassment, which was rich coming from a man hiding behind paperwork. I didn't reply, not because I had nothing to say, but because some conversations end better when they never happen. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by notes, receipts, school forms, and memories that never asked to be evidence. I felt something settle in my chest, not fear this time, but a quiet, burning resolve that surprised me. Because when someone tries to erase 8 years with a signature, they underestimate how deeply time can carve itself into you. And as we prepared to walk into that courtroom, I sensed the ground shifting beneath them, because they had no idea what we were about to put on the judge's desk.
When we walked into the courthouse, I felt my age in my knees before I felt it in my heart. The hallways smelled like old paper and nervous sweat, and I remember thinking that places like this never care who's right, only who's prepared. I watched my husband adjust his tie for the third time, and I almost smiled because after 40 years of marriage, I know that means he's scared but refusing to show it. Marla sat across the room with Hayes, not looking at us, her hands folded so tightly they'd gone pale. I wondered when my daughter learned to sit like a stranger. A clerk asked if we were the grandparents, and I answered yes too quickly, as if someone might take the word away if I hesitated. We were told to wait, and waiting has always been my weak spot. I tap, I straighten, I rearrange things that don't need rearranging. I accidentally knocked over a stack of pamphlets about family reunification and whispered an apology to no one, then stacked them back upside down without realizing it. My husband leaned over and said, "Well, at least we're already failing the organization test," and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. When the bailiff finally called our case, my mouth went dry in a way no amount of water could fix. I looked at Marlo then, really looked, and saw fear flicker across her face before she masked it with something colder. That hurt more than anger ever could. As we stood, I felt the weight of 8 years press into my spine, school mornings, fevers, birthdays, scraped knees, quiet bedtime prayers. They were calling it a dispute, but to me it felt like someone questioning whether my life had actually happened. I squared my shoulders anyway, because if this room was going to judge us, it would have to look me in the eye first. And as we took our seats, I noticed Hayes glance at our folder with sudden unease, as if he'd just realized we hadn't come empty-handed. The judge began by asking routine questions, the kind that sound harmless until you realize every word can tilt a life. Hayes' lawyer spoke first, using smooth phrases about temporary arrangements and concern for stability, as if children were furniture you repositioned during renovations. I watched my husband grip his pen too tightly, and when it snapped in half, he muttered that cheap office supplies were part of a larger conspiracy, which almost made me laugh at the wrong time. Marlo avoided my eyes, staring straight ahead like the truth might dissolve if she didn't look at it. When it was our turn, Corbin laid out dates and facts with calm precision, and I felt grateful for people who know how to speak without shaking. Still, the judge turned to us and asked why we hadn't immediately contacted authorities, and the room felt suddenly smaller. I answered honestly that we believed our daughter, because believing your child is a habit that doesn't fade just because you grow gray. There was a pause, long enough for me to notice a crooked picture frame behind the bench and wonder why no one ever fixes those things. Hayes shifted in his seat, and for the first time his confidence cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but I saw it. The judge asked about daily routines, schooling, medical care, and as I listened, I realized we knew every answer without checking notes. 8 years does that to you. It trains memory into muscle. My husband leaned toward me and whispered that he'd forgotten to silence his phone, then panicked when it buzzed, only to realize it was the weather alert, which felt like the universe mocking us. When Corbin mentioned documented caregiving, Hayes' lawyer stiffened, and Marlo finally looked up, confusion flashing across her face. I understood then that she hadn't been told everything, that someone had decided ignorance was safer than honesty. The judge asked if there was anything else we wished to submit, and Corbin slowly placed a thick envelope on the desk. As the judge opened it and began to read, the room went so quiet I could hear my own pulse argue with my ribs. The judge didn't rush, and that slowness was almost unbearable, like watching someone read your diary without permission. Page after page, his expression shifted, not dramatically, just subtly, the way people change when facts start replacing assumptions. Those documents weren't emotional. They were quiet, stubborn proof, school registrations, medical authorizations, emergency contacts signed years ago. I remembered signing some of them with a pen that barely worked, grumbling about cheap ink, never imagining those signatures would one day defend our sanity. Hayes leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something sharp, and for the first time I saw real irritation break through his polish. Marlowe's eyes widened as she leaned forward, clearly seeing papers she'd never been shown. The judge asked Hayes a question, simple, direct, and Hayes answered too fast, like a man stepping onto a floor he assumed was solid. Then came the pause, the kind that makes your ears ring, and the judge looked up and asked, "Why were these arrangements never disclosed to the court?" No one answered immediately, and that silence felt heavier than shouting. My husband shifted beside me, his knee bouncing, and I squeezed his hand because sometimes grounding someone is more important than words. The judge removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and I noticed a coffee stain on his robe that looked suspiciously human. He asked if there was any explanation for the 8 years of documented caregiving being described as temporary, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of the word. Hayes finally spoke about misunderstandings and intentions, but the sentences sounded thin, like excuses stretched too far. Marlowe whispered his name, not angrily, but with the kind of shock that comes from realizing you've been edited out of your own story. I sat very still, because something important was happening, something fragile and decisive. And when the judge placed the document flat on the desk and looked directly at them, I felt the balance in the room begin to shift slowly, unmistakably, in our direction. The judge leaned back and asked for clarification, his voice steady in a way that made dishonesty feel clumsy. Hayes tried to explain timelines, but the dates betrayed him, lining up too neatly with our records to be coincidence. My husband attempted to stand when addressed and knocked his chair back with a sharp scrape, then muttered that gravity had been aggressive lately, which earned a few restrained smiles from the gallery. The judge raised an eyebrow, not amused, not angry, just attentive, and that felt worse for Hayes than any scolding. Marlowe finally spoke, her voice thin, asking why she'd never seen those forms, and the question landed like a dropped plate no one rushed to clean. Hayes answered for her, too quickly, and the judge stopped him with a single lifted finger. "Let her speak," he said, and the room obeyed. I watched my daughter struggle between loyalty and realization, and I hated that someone had put her there. The judge asked us about consent, medical, educational, daily, and I answered calmly because the truth was no longer fragile. We had consent because we were trusted, and trust doesn't vanish just because someone regrets it later. My husband whispered that he'd forgotten his reading glasses, then realized they were on his head, which somehow cut the tension without breaking it. The judge asked Hayes why he'd contacted authorities before speaking to us, and Hayes finally faltered, searching for words that wouldn't come. That hesitation spoke louder than any argument we'd made. The judge noted it, wrote something down, and asked for a brief recess. As everyone stood, I felt a tremor run through me, not fear, but the strain of holding hope without letting it spill. When we sat back down minutes later, I sensed that the air itself had changed, like a door had quietly closed behind them. When the judge returned, his tone was different, not colder, but sharper, like someone done tolerating fog. He summarized what he'd seen, and hearing our lives reduced to bullet points was strange, like listening to someone else read your wedding vows. Hayes sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight I wondered if it hurt, while Marlowe's hands trembled in her lap. The judge spoke about continuity, about the risk of sudden separation, and my heart hammered because those words carry real weight in rooms like this. He asked what would happen if the children were removed immediately, and for the first time Hayes didn't answer at all. My husband leaned toward the microphone when invited and cleared his throat so loudly it echoed, then apologized and said age had turned his sinuses into a public nuisance. I squeezed his knee, half to steady him, half because I needed something solid. He spoke about the kids' routines, about who wakes them when nightmares come, and I saw the judge nod, not kindly, but thoughtfully. The threat became clear then. One wrong conclusion and 8 years could vanish in a single ruling. Marlowe finally broke down, whispering that she never meant for it to go this far, and I believed her in that moment. But belief doesn't undo damage, and the judge reminded everyone of that without raising his voice. He mentioned the seriousness of false reports and misrepresentation, and Hayes visibly flinched, like a word had struck bone. My husband fumbled with a tissue and dropped it, then joked softly that at least gravity was consistent today, which made the judge pause for half a second. That pause mattered because it reminded everyone we were people, not case numbers. The judge announced that a decision would be issued shortly, and my chest tightened with the kind of fear that doesn't scream, it waits. As we stood, I realized this was the moment where everything we loved balanced on someone else's understanding of truth. We waited in the hallway afterward, the kind of waiting that makes minutes feel like a test of endurance. My husband tried to sit, missed the bench slightly, and corrected himself with a quiet grunt, whispering that the furniture was clearly shrinking with age. I almost smiled, then remembered where we were and why, and the smile folded back into something tighter. Marla stood apart from us, staring at the floor like it might explain how things had gone so wrong. I wanted to reach for her, but some distances aren't measured in steps. When the clerk finally called us back, my heart thudded so loudly I worried it might count as a disruption. The judge spoke carefully, weighing words the way surgeons weigh instruments, and I understood this was the moment people later describe as everything changed. He talked about credibility, about patterns, about how 8 years is not an accident or a misunderstanding. My husband nodded too soon, then stopped himself as if afraid to jinx reality by agreeing out loud. The judge addressed Marlo directly, asking whether she truly believed this care had been temporary, and her silence answered before she could. Hayes tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand, and the room obeyed again. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that arrives only when you've done all you can and braced for the rest. The judge said there would be consequences for misrepresentation and false allegations, and I heard Hayes inhale sharply. My husband leaned toward me and whispered that if this was a movie, this would be the part where the music swells, and despite everything, I let out a soft breath of laughter. The judge paused, looked down at the final page in front of him, and adjusted his glasses. And just before he spoke the ruling, he asked one last question that made the entire room go still. Did you truly think none of this would ever come to light? The ruling came calmly, without drama, and that was its power. The judge recognized our caregiving as established, continuous, and lawful, and he stated it as fact, not opinion. Temporary custody was affirmed in our favor, with clear conditions and protections, and for the first time in years, I felt my shoulders drop. Marlo began to cry quietly, not from anger, but from the shock of realizing how far things had gone without her truly seeing it. Hayes sat frozen, as if paperwork had finally failed him, and no one rushed to soften that moment. The judge spoke about accountability, about consequences for false claims, and about how courts remember patterns longer than people expect. My husband exhaled so hard he nearly fogged his glasses, then whispered that he'd been holding that breath since 2016, which earned a brief, human nod from the judge. We were instructed on next steps, schedules, safeguards, and responsibilities, and every word sounded like structure returning to a life that had been shaken loose. As we stood to leave, my husband reached for his coat, put it on backward, and corrected himself with a shrug that said, "Still winning, just slowly." In the hallway, Nolan ran to us, asking if we could go home now, and I said yes with a certainty I hadn't felt in a long time. Marlo approached us hesitantly, eyes swollen, and I saw my daughter again, not the stranger from the courtroom, but the frightened child she used to be. I told her this wasn't the end, but it was a line, and lines matter. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, like truth had weight and someone had finally set it down properly. We walked to the car together, not triumphant, not broken, just steady. And as I watched my husband buckle the kids in, fumbling slightly with the straps and blaming modern technology, I understood something clearly. They hadn't broken us. We stood our ground and we won.